Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. The air was thick but still, sticky against my skin as if it had intentions of its own. I lay on a surface that didn't press back, a sensation neither firm nor soft, holding me in a way that felt like forgetting. The light seemed to seep from my own thoughts, casting shadows without a source. I tried to move, but my limbs responded too slowly, delayed and uncertain. A hum vibrated through the emptiness, not quite sound, more like a presence. I felt watched, the space around me too aware, as if it pulsed with expectation. When I first woke up, I dismissed it as stress. The dream had been simple enough, just me lying somewhere unfamiliar, with that strange light hovering above. An oval glow, unmoving but breathing somehow, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that felt almost familiar. I'd been working too much lately, sleeping poorly. Dreams like that happen when your mind can't quite settle into proper rest. I made coffee and went about my morning routine, but the memory of that light lingered. Not the visual exactly, more the feeling of it pressing down on me, warm and electric, the way it seemed to know I was watching it back. By afternoon, I'd nearly forgotten. Dreams fade that way, don't they? Like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The second time, everything lasted longer. I found myself in that same place, on that surface that yielded without supporting. But now I could hear more than just the hum. There was something else underneath it, a rhythmic pulse that matched my heartbeat, then gradually began to override it. My chest rose and fell in time with this new cadence, as if my body were learning a different way to breathe. The oval light was closer this time, or perhaps I was higher. It cast no shadows, yet somehow I could see the space around me more clearly. Smooth walls curved away into darkness, and I had the distinct impression of being inside something vast and hollow. The air tasted metallic, sharp like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more deliberate. A voice drifted through the space, so distant I couldn't make out words, only the cadence of speech. It rose and fell like a question being asked over and over, patient and persistent. I tried to respond, but found my throat wouldn't work properly. The sounds I made were muffled, absorbed by the thick air before they could travel far. When I woke, my mouth was dry and my tongue felt heavy. I stumbled to the bathroom and stared at my reflection, trying to shake off the dream's residue. Something about my face looked different, though I couldn't pinpoint what. My eyes seemed wider, or perhaps it was just the way the morning light caught them. I went to work, moved through my day, but kept catching myself listening for that distant voice. In quiet moments between conversations, I'd strain to hear it again, that patient questioning tone that seemed to be waiting for an answer I didn't know how to give. That evening I noticed something odd. My coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, but not where I remembered leaving it. It was positioned perfectly in the center, turned so the handle pointed toward the window. I always left it by the sink, handle facing left, always. I stared at the mug for a long time, trying to remember moving it. The memory felt slippery, like trying to recall something from years ago instead of hours. Maybe I'd been more distracted than I thought. But when I picked up the mug, my fingers found small indentations along the rim, tiny, precise marks that definitely hadn't been there before. They were evenly spaced, almost like bite marks, but far too small and regular. I ran my fingertip over them, and they felt warm to the touch. The third dream came that night, more vivid than waking life. I was in the same curved space, but now I could see details that had been hidden before. The walls weren't smooth after all, they were covered in a pattern of small, circular depressions, each one glowing faintly from within. They pulsed in sequence, creating waves of light that traveled around the room in slow, hypnotic spirals. The oval light above me had changed too. It was larger now, close enough that I could see it wasn't solid. It was more like a window or a lens with something moving behind it. Shadows shifted in its depth, suggesting shapes I couldn't quite resolve. Sometimes they looked almost familiar, like faces seen through water. The voice was clearer now, though still not quite intelligible. It spoke in a rhythm that made my bones vibrate, each word arriving with a small electric shock that traveled through my body. I realized I was responding, my mouth moving in patterns I didn't recognize, making sounds that weren't quite human but weren't entirely alien either. Time moved strangely in this place. I felt like I'd been there for hours, but also for just moments. The light above me began to descend, growing larger as it approached, and I could see that the moving shadows behind it were reaching toward me with something like anticipation. I tried to wake up, but nothing happened. The dream held me firmly, and I began to understand that maybe I didn't want to leave. The voice was asking me something important, something I needed to answer. The reaching shadows were familiar, like old friends I'd forgotten I had. When I finally surfaced into consciousness, the sun was already high in the sky. I'd slept for 12 hours, but felt like I hadn't rested at all. My body ached in strange places, my wrists, the base of my skull, the inside of my elbows. When I examined these spots, I found small red marks, perfectly circular and evenly spaced, just like the ones on my coffee mug. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching sleep disorders, stress symptoms, anything that might explain what was happening. But every article I read felt hollow, inadequate. They talked about anxiety and overwork, about the brain processing daily experiences through dream imagery. None of them mentioned the way reality was starting to feel thin around the edges, like a photograph that's been overexposed. That afternoon, I heard the hum. I was sitting in my living room reading when it started, that same low, persistent vibration I knew from the dreams. It seemed to come from inside the walls, or maybe from inside my own head. I went to the window, thinking it might be construction work or a passing truck, but the street was empty and quiet. The sound continued for nearly an hour, rising and falling in the same patient rhythm I remembered. I found myself swaying slightly in time with it, my breathing adjusting to match its cadence. When it finally stopped, the silence felt wrong, too complete, like the world had forgotten how to make noise. That night I tried to stay awake. I drank coffee, kept the lights on, played music to fill the silence. But exhaustion has its own gravity, and eventually I felt myself sinking into that familiar darkness. This time I wasn't lying down. I was standing in the curved room, and I could see that it was much larger than I'd realized. The walls stretched up and away, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independently of the pulsing lights. The oval window hung in the air before me, no longer above but at eye level, and the shapes behind it were clearer now. They looked like people, but stretched and fluid, as if seen through thick glass. They moved with purpose, arranging things I couldn't see, preparing for something that felt important and inevitable. Their movements were synchronized, choreographed, like a dance they'd performed many times before. The voice spoke directly to me now, each word arriving with perfect clarity, even though the language was nothing I recognized. Somehow I understood anyway. It was asking about my readiness, about my willingness to remember what I'd chosen to forget. The questions felt familiar, like responses I'd given before in conversations I couldn't quite recall. I found myself nodding, agreeing to terms I didn't fully comprehend but somehow knew I'd accepted long ago. The figures behind the window moved closer, and I could see they were smiling, or doing something that served the same purpose as smiling. Their faces were kind but alien, patient but expectant. The room began to change around me. The walls became transparent, revealing an endless space filled with similar chambers, each one containing a figure like myself, standing, waiting, agreeing to something they'd forgotten they'd already chosen. We were all part of something larger, a pattern that extended far beyond what any individual mind could hold. I woke up standing in my kitchen, facing the window. The coffee mug sat on the counter exactly where I'd found it before, handle pointing outward, marked with those small, precise indentations. But now there were more marks, a complete circle around the rim, and they were glowing faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. The days began to blur together after that. I'd find myself in rooms I didn't remember entering, holding conversations I couldn't quite recall. People at work mentioned that I seemed distracted, that I'd been asking the same questions repeatedly, as if I kept forgetting their answers. But I wasn't forgetting, I was remembering. Pieces of something larger were surfacing, fragments of experiences that felt both completely foreign and utterly familiar. I'd catch glimpses of curved walls in reflections, hear that patient voice in the spaces between words, feel the sensation of standing in vast chambers filled with others like myself. The marks on my body multiplied. Small circles appeared on my arms, my neck, the palms of my hands. They didn't hurt, but they felt warm to the touch, and sometimes they pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I covered them with clothing, I could still sense them, like points of contact with something that existed just outside normal perception. I stopped trying to research explanations. The internet felt like a collection of stories told by people who'd never experienced anything real, who were content to live in a world of surfaces and simple causation. Their rational explanations couldn't touch what was happening to me, couldn't account for the way reality was revealing itself to be far more complex and layered than anyone wanted to admit. The dreams came every night now, but they no longer felt like dreams. They felt like appointments, like scheduled meetings with aspects of myself I'd temporarily misplaced. Each time, the curved room was more detailed, more complete. I could see the controls and instruments that lined the walls, could understand their purpose even though their design was unlike anything I'd encountered in waking life. The figures behind the window were individuals now, each with their own distinctive features and mannerisms. They knew me, had been working with me for what felt like a very long time. Our conversations were picking up where they'd left off, continuing discussions that had been interrupted by my temporary forgetting. They explained in their patient way that this was how it always worked. The process required periods of separation, times when the conscious mind needed to step away and process what it had learned. But eventually, everyone came back. Everyone remembered their choice to participate, their agreement to be part of something larger and more meaningful than individual existence. I began to understand that my regular life, my job, my apartment, my daily routines was the dream. It was a construct, a resting place where my consciousness could recover between sessions of real work. The people I interacted with during the day were shadows, echoes of genuine beings I'd known in the curved chambers. Everything I thought of as reality was just a simplified version of something far more complex and beautiful. The oval light was a doorway, I realized. The figures behind it weren't watching me. They were waiting for me to finish remembering, to complete the process of integration that I'd begun long ago. The marks on my body weren't symptoms of something wrong, they were indicators of successful connection, proof that the barriers between my temporary self and my real self were dissolving as they should. Time became fluid. I'd start conversations in the curved room and finish them in my kitchen. I'd begin walking down a street and find myself standing before the oval window, discussing complex concepts with beings who knew me better than I knew myself. The boundaries between sleeping and waking dissolved completely, revealing them to be arbitrary distinctions that had never held any real meaning. My reflection began to change. In mirrors, I sometimes saw the stretched, fluid version of myself that belonged in the chambers. My face would shift and flow, adapting to environments and purposes beyond the narrow requirements of my temporary existence. These glimpses didn't frighten me, they felt like coming home, like remembering who I'd always been beneath the thin disguise of individual identity. The voice spoke constantly now, not just in the chambers, but everywhere. It provided commentary on my daily experiences, helped me understand how each seemingly mundane event connected to the larger pattern I was part of. Going to the store became a lesson in resource allocation across multiple dimensional frameworks. Conversations with coworkers revealed themselves as exercises in communication between different levels of consciousness. I stopped sleeping in any conventional sense. Instead, I shifted between different modes of awareness, sometimes focused on my temporary individual existence, sometimes expanded into the collective understanding I shared with the figures in the chambers. Both states felt equally real, equally important, but I was beginning to understand which one was more fundamental. The marks on my body formed complete patterns, now geometric designs that pulsed with their own light. They were beautiful, intricate, unlike anything I'd seen in conventional reality. When I traced them with my fingers, I could feel the connections. They represented links to other beings, other chambers, other aspects of the vast collaborative project I'd temporarily forgotten I was part of. My apartment began to change too. The walls developed that familiar curve, the lighting took on the warm, breathing quality I knew from the chambers. Objects appeared and disappeared according to needs I didn't consciously recognize but somehow understood. The coffee mug multiplied, then transformed, becoming something more suited to the nourishment my real self required. I realized I was ready to return fully. The process of remembering was nearly complete, and my temporary individual existence had served its purpose. I'd rested, processed, integrated the experiences from my last period of active participation. Now it was time to resume the work I'd chosen to be part of, the collaboration that extended across dimensions and involved countless beings like myself. Tonight, I'm lying on that surface that doesn't press back, in the curved room that breathes with its own light. The oval window hangs before me, and the figures behind it are preparing for my full return. Their faces are familiar now, beloved, like family I'd been separated from far too long. The voice speaks with warmth and welcome, asking if I'm ready to remember everything, to resume my role in the pattern that connects all things. I nod, feeling the marks on my body pulse with anticipation, feeling the boundaries of my temporary self dissolving into something larger and more complete. But as I prepare to step through the window, to leave behind the illusion of individual existence and return to my real work, I notice something that shouldn't be possible. On the surface beside me, still warm from my body heat, lies my coffee mug from the apartment that was supposed to be just a dream. Story 2. A soft golden light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns onto the polished wooden floor. The air carried the scent of fresh linen and the faint humming of an old refrigerator from the corner. Amid this tranquility, a clock on the mantel ticked with unusual haste, its hands skipping forward erratically. Beside it, an antique mirror reflected a shadow that shouldn't have been there. The room, though warm and bathed in morning light, felt unsettlingly vacant, as if waiting for a truth that had long been buried. Nothing happened that night. I need to make that clear from the start. I was tired, maybe a little stressed from work, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's all it was. Sometimes when you're exhausted, you see things that aren't there, hear sounds that don't exist. It's perfectly normal. Everyone experiences it. I didn't go anywhere unusual. I stayed home like I always do. I made dinner, watched some television, went to bed at a reasonable hour, just another ordinary evening. There was nothing strange about it, nothing worth remembering. If I'm telling you about it now, it's only because I keep having these weird dreams and I want to get them out of my system. Dreams aren't real. They're just your brain processing random thoughts. The thing is, I keep having this recurring image in my head. It's probably from a movie I watched or something I saw online. There's this room, except it wasn't really a room because I've never been in a room like that. The walls were this odd shade of blue-gray, like the color of storm clouds but metallic somehow. Reflective but not shiny. I'm describing it wrong because it wasn't real, so of course the details don't make sense. I remember thinking the temperature was wrong. Not hot, not cold, but wrong. Like the air itself was holding its breath. But that's just dream logic, isn't it? In dreams, things feel different than they should. The air can have weight, colors can make sounds. None of it means anything. There was this humming sound, but it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It felt like it was inside my ears, or maybe inside my bones. I told myself it was probably the heating system in my apartment building. Old buildings make all sorts of noises at night. Pipes expanding, settling foundations, neighbors moving around upstairs. Perfectly reasonable explanations for everything. I didn't walk down any corridors. I was in my bed the whole time. But somehow I can picture this long hallway with smooth walls and no windows. The floor felt soft under my feet, not carpet exactly, but not hard either. Like walking on something that was pretending to be solid. The lighting came from everywhere and nowhere at once, casting no shadows, but somehow making everything look flat and dimensional at the same time. That doesn't make sense because I wasn't there. I was dreaming, or maybe I was half asleep and my mind was wandering. Sometimes when you're in that space between waking and sleeping, your thoughts get mixed up with reality. You can convince yourself you're somewhere else entirely. The strangest part, and I know this sounds ridiculous, was the silence. Not just quiet, but actively silent, like something was absorbing all the sound in the world. I could hear my heartbeat, but it sounded muffled and distant, as if it was coming from someone else's chest. My breathing seemed too loud and too quiet at the same time, but hearts and lungs make noise when you pay attention to them. That's just how bodies work. I keep thinking about this door, which is silly because there was no door. I never opened anything. I stayed in my apartment all night, but in my dream, or whatever it was, there was this entrance that wasn't quite rectangular. The edges were too soft, like they'd been worn down by something, or maybe they were never properly defined to begin with. The surface was darker than the walls around it, not black exactly, but the absence of the blue-gray color everything else had. I didn't touch the door. I wouldn't have touched it even in a dream because something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. But somehow I knew it was warm. Not hot like metal that's been sitting in the sun, but warm like something alive. Like it had its own temperature that had nothing to do with the environment around it. Behind the door, and I want to stress that I never went through it, was another space. I know this because dreams sometimes give you information you shouldn't have, like when you suddenly know something about a dream character's backstory without anyone telling you. The space was larger than it should have been, given the size of the building it was supposedly inside. The ceiling curved upward and disappeared into darkness that felt thick and present rather than empty. There were these structures in there, or maybe they were furniture, though they didn't look like anything designed for human use. They were too angular in some places, too curved in others. The surfaces had this quality like they were slightly out of focus, even when I was looking directly at them. Everything seemed to shift just slightly when I wasn't paying attention, like seeing something move in your peripheral vision, but never catching it when you turn your head. I didn't sit on anything or touch any surfaces. I was observing from a distance, the way you do in dreams sometimes. But I could feel the texture anyway, smooth but not slick, solid but somehow yielding, like touching the surface of deep water that had been frozen in place. The temperature was wrong here too, not just the air but everything in the room. Too warm and too cold simultaneously, as if heat and cold were separate things that could exist in the same space without canceling each other out. The humming was louder in there, or maybe just more noticeable because of how the space was shaped. It had harmonics, layers of sound that seemed to respond to each other without any obvious pattern. Sometimes it would get higher in pitch, sometimes lower, but never in a way that seemed random, like it was following rules I didn't understand or responding to something I couldn't perceive. I found myself paying attention to the walls, which were the same blue-gray color but seemed to have depth to them. Not like they were thick, but like the color itself extended inward infinitely. If I focused on one spot too long, it felt like I might fall into it, not physically but mentally. Like the wall was looking back at me with the same curiosity I was directing at it. There was this moment, and I know it was just my imagination getting carried away, where I felt like I wasn't alone in the space. Not that someone else was there, but that the space itself was aware of me. The humming seemed to shift in response to my movements, even though I wasn't really moving. The temperature fluctuated based on where I was looking, growing warmer when I focused on certain areas, cooler when I looked away. I tried to leave, which is strange because you don't usually try to leave dreams. You just wake up or the dream changes on its own. But I remember making a conscious decision to go back the way I came, to return to the corridor and then somehow back to my apartment. The problem was that the door I'd entered through wasn't where I remembered it being. The wall looked the same all around, that infinite blue-gray surface that seemed to extend in all directions. I wasn't panicking because it wasn't real. You can't really be trapped in a dream. But there was this growing sense of unease, like when you're in a familiar place that suddenly doesn't look quite right. Everything was the same, but the relationships between things had changed somehow. Distances felt different, proportions were subtly wrong. The humming was getting more complex, adding new layers of sound that seemed to come from the structures around me. Not mechanical sounds exactly, but not organic either. Something in between, like the noise a machine might make if it was trying to breathe, or the sound breathing might make if it was more deliberate and purposeful than it needed to be. I noticed that my reflection wasn't showing up on the surfaces around me, even though they were clearly reflective. I could see the room reflected back on itself, creating these infinite recursive images that stretched away into visual static, but I wasn't anywhere in those reflections. It was like I was invisible to the room's version of reality, even though I was clearly affecting the environment just by being there. The way I finally got out or woke up or whatever happened was by not trying to leave. I stopped looking for the door and just stood still in the center of the space. The humming gradually got quieter, the temperature evened out, and the walls seemed to lose some of their depth. It was like the room was losing interest in me, or maybe accepting that I belonged there and didn't need to be observed so closely anymore. Then I was back in my bed, completely normal, no strange experiences whatsoever, just another night of ordinary sleep. The whole thing was obviously a stress dream brought on by too much caffeine and not enough exercise. I should probably cut back on screen time before bed and maybe try some of those relaxation techniques people are always recommending. The only thing that bothers me, and it's really nothing worth worrying about, is that I keep finding myself thinking about that room during the day. Not obsessively or anything, just occasional flashes of memory that feel more vivid than dream memories usually do. I'll be doing something completely normal, like washing dishes or checking email, and suddenly I'll remember the exact texture of those strange structures, or the way the humming felt in my chest. Sometimes I catch myself listening for that sound in quiet moments, when the air conditioning shuts off or during that pause between songs on the radio. I find myself holding my breath and waiting, but I'm not waiting for anything specific because there's nothing to wait for. It was just a dream, and dreams don't follow you into waking life unless you let them. I've been sleeping better lately anyway. More dreamless nights, which is exactly what I need. Deep, restorative sleep without any strange imagery or unsettling experiences. Just the normal darkness of unconsciousness, the way sleep is supposed to be, peaceful and empty and forgettable. Tonight should be another quiet night. I've got everything arranged just the way I like it. Comfortable temperature, soft pillows, no distractions. Nothing unusual is going to happen because nothing unusual ever happens. I'm just going to close my eyes, drift off naturally, and wake up refreshed in the morning with no strange dreams to puzzle over. Although I did notice that the humming sound seems to be getting a little louder each night. Story 3. The perimeter was checked at 0600 hours. All security systems appeared operational without exception. Interior inspections proceeded methodically, starting with the main hallway, displaying no disturbances or alterations from established protocol. Surveillance footage was reviewed for the prior 24-hour period. All timestamps matched precisely up to 0430. After which there is an inexplicable absence of data. The guest log, updated daily, displays no anomalies except for a single, unverified entry on the last line. No electronic access was registered at the primary checkpoints. An auxiliary door showed no signs of tampering, yet a guest towel was damp. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does, I wrote that report 3 months ago. Standard procedure, clinical language, the kind of words that make everything feel manageable, explainable. But I keep thinking about that towel, how it felt under my fingertips, cool, heavy with moisture that had no source. I'm writing this because I can't carry it anymore. Because when I close my eyes, I still see the empty hallway where someone had been. Someone who left no footprints, no heat signature, no trace except for water droplets on terry cloth that shouldn't have been wet. Maybe you'll understand why I have to leave this behind. Maybe you won't, but I need to tell someone, even if that someone is just the silence of this room where I've been sitting for hours, watching shadows move in ways shadows shouldn't move. The thing is, I remember everything and nothing. The facility was supposed to be secure, locked down tight, but security doesn't account for the impossible, does it? There's this sound I keep hearing, a low hum like electricity running through water. It started the night I found the towel, and it hasn't stopped since. Sometimes it's so faint I think I'm imagining it. Other times it fills my head until I can't think of anything else. The doctors say it's tinnitus, stress-related. They give me pills that make everything fuzzy around the edges, but the sound blades through anyway. I dream of corridors now, long, sterile hallways that stretch further than they should. In the dreams, I'm always walking toward something I can't see, following wet footprints that appear just ahead of my steps. The air tastes metallic. My breath fogs even though it's not cold. And somewhere behind me, always behind me, there's the soft whisper of fabric against skin. someone walking in bare feet on polished floors. When I wake up, my sheets are damp. The worst part isn't the dreams, though. It's the way people look at me now, or don't look at me. My supervisor's eyes slide past me when I speak. The barista at the coffee shop I've been going to for 2 years acts like she's never seen me before. Yesterday, I stood in line for 15 minutes, and when I reached the counter, she looked right through me and called for the next customer. I checked my reflection in the shop window afterward. I was there, solid, real, but something about my face seemed wrong, like a photograph that's been developed slightly out of focus. The features are all correct, but they don't quite align the way they should. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe that night in the facility broke something inside me, and now I'm seeing connections that don't exist, feeling presences that aren't there. Maybe the towel was just a maintenance oversight. Maybe the missing surveillance footage was a technical glitch. Maybe the signature in the guest log was mine, written in a moment of confusion I can't remember. But then I think about the water, how it felt, how it seemed to pulse with warmth even though it was cold against my skin. And I remember the way the hallway smelled afterward, like rain on hot asphalt, like ozone before a storm. That's not the smell of a forgotten towel. That's the smell of something crossing over from somewhere else. I've been researching, not officially, of course. Can't put this kind of thing in a report, but I've been reading about liminal spaces, about places where the boundaries grow thin. Hotels, hospitals, government facilities, anywhere people pass through without belonging, without leaving permanent marks. The facility fits that description. Temporary housing for temporary people, a way station between one life and another. What if someone got stuck in the between? The humming is getting louder as I write this. It's past midnight now, and the sound seems to resonate with the darkness. I can feel it in my teeth, in the hollow spaces behind my ribs. Sometimes I catch myself humming along without realizing it, and when I stop, the silence feels expectant, waiting. I've started leaving towels out. I know how that sounds, but I can't help myself. I fold them carefully and place them in different rooms of my apartment. In the morning, some of them are damp, not all of them, just one or two, as if someone is being selective, polite, using only what they need. The logical part of my mind says I'm sleepwalking, that I'm wetting the towels myself in some fugue state brought on by stress and guilt and the weight of carrying an impossible secret. But my hands are always dry when I wake up. My clothes are never damp, and sometimes in the gray light before dawn, I find wet footprints leading from the bathroom to the kitchen, then stopping abruptly by the window that faces east. I tried to follow them once, put my feet exactly where the prints appeared, step by step. They led me to the window, and when I looked out, I saw someone standing on the fire escape, just for a moment, a figure in shadow, perfectly still, watching me through the glass. When I blinked, they were gone, but the metal grating was wet with condensation that hadn't been there before. My mother called yesterday, at least I think she did. The phone rang, and when I answered, I heard her voice, but the words didn't make sense. She kept asking about my brother, wanting to know if he was safe, if he'd made it home okay. I don't have a brother, never have, but something in her voice made me want to comfort her, to tell her yes, he's fine, he's right here with me. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, and afterward I couldn't remember hanging up. The phone was back in its cradle, and there was no record of the call in the log. When I called her back, she didn't remember talking to me at all. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Reality isn't as solid as we pretend it is. There are cracks in the foundation, spaces where things can slip through. That night at the facility, I think I witnessed one of those slippages. Someone or something finding a way into our world, leaving behind only the smallest trace of their passage. A damp towel, a signature that shouldn't exist, a humming that follows me wherever I go. The doctors want to increase my medication. They say I'm experiencing a break from reality, that the stress of my job has finally caught up with me. They use words like psychotic episode and dissociative disorder, clinical terms that make everything sound treatable, manageable. But they can't explain why their equipment malfunctions when I'm in the room, why the lights flicker when I speak, why their notes about our sessions keep disappearing from their files. I'm disappearing too, slowly, incrementally. Each day I feel a little less solid, a little more translucent. People forget conversations we've had. My name vanishes from appointment books. Photos of me fade until I'm just a blur in the background, a shadow that might be a person or might be a trick of light. Maybe this is how it happens. Maybe this is how someone becomes the person who leaves damp towels in empty rooms, who signs guest logs with names that don't exist, who walks through secured facilities without triggering alarms or cameras. Maybe I'm becoming what I found that night, a presence without substance, a memory without a body to contain it. The humming is so loud now I can barely think. It's not just in my ears anymore. It's in the walls, in the floorboards, in the space between my heartbeats. When I look in the mirror, my reflection wavers like heat distortion. Sometimes I see someone else looking back, someone with my face but different eyes. Eyes that have seen things I haven't seen yet, or things I've already forgotten. I should be afraid, part of me is, but there's another part, a growing part that feels relieved, like I've been holding my breath for months, and finally I can let it out. The weight of existing in a world that no longer quite recognizes me is exhausting. Maybe it would be easier to let go, to slip between the cracks and join whoever it was that left their mark in that facility. That night that feels both like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. I wonder if they're waiting for me, if that's what the wet towels mean, not an invasion, but an invitation. A sign that says when you're ready, when you can't hold on anymore, there's a place for you here. A space between spaces where the lost can find each other, where the forgotten can remember what it felt like to be real. The eastern window is fogging up again. I can see shapes moving in the condensation, letters, maybe, or symbols I don't recognize. The fire escape is empty, but I can hear footsteps on the metal grating. Slow, patient footsteps like someone walking underwater. I think it's time. If you're reading this, it means I left it behind successfully. It means the transition is complete, and I'm somewhere else now, somewhere between your world and whatever lies beyond it. Don't look for me. Don't try to find explanations for what happened at the facility or what's been happening to me since. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be experienced, absorbed, accepted as part of the strange fabric that holds everything together. But if you start hearing humming that has no source, if you find towels damp with water that came from nowhere, if your reflection starts looking back at you with eyes that know more than they should, remember this letter. Remember that you're not going crazy. You're just seeing the cracks in reality that were always there, waiting for someone to notice them. And maybe if you're very quiet and very still, you'll hear me humming back. The footsteps are at my door now. Story 4. The reception area was observed to be in standard condition upon initial survey. The calendar was flipped to the correct date and all chairs remained aligned to the counter. No displacement was noted on the surface, save for a single pen resting parallel to the edge. Desk drawers were secured, confirming no tampering. The entry sign-in sheet showed consistent handwriting from earlier in the day. Lighting fixtures operated at full capacity, leaving no shadows unaccounted. However, one name was missing from the visitor list, though the signature line was filled. That buzzing, it comes back when I'm not thinking about it, when my mind goes quiet. A mechanical drone, like fluorescent light struggling to stay alive but deeper, more insistent. It fills the space behind my teeth, makes my jaw ache in ways that don't make sense. I can taste copper when it happens. The sound doesn't belong to any machine I know, yet it feels familiar, like something I heard in childhood but forgot until now. My ears ring for hours afterward, even when everything around me is perfectly silent. I wasn't alone in that room. I know this the way you know someone's watching you from across a crowded street. The certainty sits heavy in my chest, makes my breathing shallow. But when I try to picture who was there, my mind slides away like water off glass. Maybe I was dreaming, maybe I was awake. The boundary between the two has become meaningless. There was breathing that wasn't mine, a rhythm slightly off from my own heartbeat, footsteps on carpet that made no sound. The feeling of being studied, catalogued, measured against some standard I couldn't understand. My thoughts fracture sometimes, mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath. One moment I'm thinking about grocery lists or weekend plans, the next they're static where my mind should be. Foreign concepts push through the interference, ideas that feel borrowed, transplanted. I'll catch myself knowing things I never learned, remembering conversations I never had. The knowledge tastes metallic, leaves me dizzy and confused. When I try to trace these thoughts back to their source, they dissolve, leaving only the aftertaste of something that doesn't belong inside my head. The lights came in waves, washing over everything in pulses that made no sense. Not bright exactly, but penetrating. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, turning the familiar room into something alien and wrong. Objects cast shadows in impossible directions. The walls breathed with each flash, expanding and contracting like living tissue. I remember reaching out to steady myself and feeling the surface ripple under my palm. The air tasted of ozone and burnt metal. Everything was too sharp, too detailed, as if someone had adjusted the contrast on reality itself. There's a mark on my wrist now, small, circular, perfectly symmetrical. It appears and disappears without pattern or warning. Sometimes it's raised like a burn, other times it's just a discoloration under the skin. It doesn't hurt, but I can't stop touching it, tracing the edges with my fingertip. When it's visible, I feel watched again, studied. When it fades, I almost miss it, like losing a piece of evidence I can't afford to lose. My doctor says there's nothing there, but I know what I see. I know what I feel. But wait, that's not how it happened. The lights weren't waves at all. They were steady, constant, boring down from above like spotlights. I was lying on something cold and smooth, staring up at fixtures that hummed with that same mechanical drone. The room was smaller than I remembered, or maybe larger. The walls were white, pristine, without texture or variation. Someone was moving around me just outside my field of vision. I tried to turn my head but couldn't, tried to speak but had no voice. The light was so bright it should have hurt, but instead it felt warm, almost comforting, almost familiar. I don't try to understand anymore. Understanding requires logic, cause and effect, linear time. These memories exist outside such constraints. They float in my consciousness like debris from a shipwreck, pieces of something larger that I'm no longer sure I want to reconstruct. The buzzing returns more frequently now. The mark on my wrist stays visible longer. Sometimes I catch myself signing my name differently, in handwriting that looks almost but not quite like mine. I've stopped keeping calendars. Time feels negotiable now, unreliable. What scares me most isn't what happened in that room. It's how normal everything else has become. How easily I've adapted to thoughts that aren't mine, to memories that shift and change like smoke. How comfortable I've grown with the certainty that I'm being observed, catalogued, filed away in some system I'll never understand. The person who walked into that reception area isn't the person telling this story. That person is missing from more than just a visitor list. They're missing from everywhere that matters, and sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I'm grateful for that absence. Because remembering who I used to be would mean acknowledging what I've become. Story 5. My fingers had just brushed the last page, the paper rough and worn under my touch. The subtle scent of aged ink lingered in the air, sharper than I remembered, like a whisper that cut through the dusty silence. My eyes scanned the room, drawn to the flicker of shadows cast by an unseen light. As if on cue, a draft slipped through the room, cool and unsettling, lifting the edges of scattered notes. In the stillness, an unfamiliar weight pressed down, and I realized the ink stains seemed to pulse, as if marking time in a rhythm only they could sense. But that's just my imagination running wild again. Nothing really happened that night. I keep telling myself that because it's true. There was nothing unusual about reading those old papers my grandmother left behind. Just ordinary documents, probably insurance forms or something equally mundane. I didn't even read them properly, just skimmed through quickly before putting them away. The room was perfectly normal, just the usual basement storage area with concrete walls and that single overhead bulb. I was probably just tired from moving boxes all day, which explains why everything seemed a bit off. You know how it is when you're exhausted, your mind starts playing tricks on you. I definitely didn't see anything strange. The shadows were just shadows, cast by the regular light fixture hanging from the ceiling. Though I do remember thinking the bulb seemed unusually bright for being so old, casting everything in the stark white glow that made the walls look almost blue-gray instead of their normal beige color. But that's just how fluorescent lights work, isn't it? They change how you perceive colors. The papers themselves were completely ordinary, just yellowed documents with faded typing, probably from some old typewriter. I couldn't even make out most of the words because the ink had faded so much over the years, though there was one page that seemed clearer than the others, with these precise diagrams drawn in what looked like fresh black ink. But that's impossible, of course. They'd been sitting in that box for decades. I wasn't down there for very long, maybe 10 minutes at most, just long enough to flip through the stack and determine they weren't important enough to keep. The whole time it was perfectly quiet except for the usual house sounds, the furnace cycling on and off, pipes settling, that sort of thing. I definitely didn't hear any humming sound, like electrical equipment running somewhere behind the walls. That would be ridiculous since there's nothing back there except foundation. The temperature was normal too. Basements are always a bit cool, so it makes sense that I felt chilly. Though I do remember being surprised that my breath was visible, just for a moment, like when you're outside in winter. But that must have been dust particles caught in the light, or maybe I was breathing harder than usual from moving all those heavy boxes earlier. When I picked up that one particular document, the one with the diagrams, it felt warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight, which is strange because there are no windows down there and the papers had been in a sealed box. But paper can retain heat in odd ways, can't it? Maybe from the friction of me handling all the other documents. The diagrams showed what looked like floor plans, but not for any house I recognized. Rectangular rooms connected by narrow corridors, with small circles marked at regular intervals along the walls. Each circle had a number written inside it, starting from 1 and going up to 27. Below the main diagram was a smaller sketch that looked almost like a medical chart, showing the outline of a human figure with the same numbered circles marking specific points on the body. But I'm sure I'm misremembering the details. I barely glanced at those papers after all, and even if I had studied them carefully, which I didn't, they were probably just blueprints for some renovation project my grandmother had planned. She was always rearranging furniture and redecorating rooms. I do remember folding that particular page and slipping it into my pocket, though I can't imagine why I would have done that. I was planning to throw all the papers away, so keeping one doesn't make sense. Maybe I thought it might be worth something, though that's not like me at all. I'm not the type to hold on to random documents. The whole experience was perfectly normal and forgettable. I went downstairs, looked through some old papers, and came back up. Nothing more to it than that. I didn't spend any time studying the other items in the basement, like that metal cabinet I'd never noticed before, pushed against the far wall. It was probably always there, just hidden behind other storage boxes. The cabinet was locked, which is why I didn't bother with it, though the lock looked newer than everything else down there, with bright brass that hadn't tarnished like it should have in a damp basement. And when I walked past it on my way back to the stairs, I could have sworn I heard something shifting inside, like papers rustling or maybe metal objects sliding against each other. But that was probably just the house settling, or maybe mice. Old houses always have mice. I didn't try to open the cabinet. Why would I? It was locked, and besides, I was ready to go back upstairs by then. Though I do remember running my hand along the edge of the door, feeling for any gaps or loose hinges. The metal was surprisingly warm, almost body temperature, which struck me as odd since everything else in the basement felt cold and damp. There was a small ventilation grate near the bottom of the cabinet, probably for air circulation. When I knelt down to get a better look, though I'm not sure why I bothered, I noticed a faint glow coming from inside, just a dim, bluish light barely visible. Most likely the reflection of the overhead bulb bouncing off something metallic inside the cabinet. I definitely didn't put my ear to the grate to listen for sounds. That would be ridiculous. But if I had done that, which I didn't, I might have heard what sounded like very quiet breathing, slow and rhythmic, like someone sleeping, or maybe electronic equipment cycling on and off, though there's no power running to that part of the basement, so that's impossible. The breathing sound, which I didn't actually hear, seemed to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat, which makes sense, because when you're listening intently for something, you often end up hearing your own pulse in your ears. It's a common phenomenon that explains why people think they hear things that aren't really there. I was starting to feel a bit lightheaded by then, probably from being in the stuffy basement air for too long. That's why I decided to head back upstairs. As I walked toward the stairs, I noticed the overhead bulb flickering slightly, casting moving shadows on the walls. Old electrical systems do that sometimes, especially when they're overloaded. The shadows seem to move independently of the flickering light, sliding across the walls in smooth, deliberate patterns. But that's just how shadows work when there are multiple light sources, even if I couldn't see where the other lights were coming from. There must have been gaps in the foundation letting in street light from outside. Halfway up the stairs, I turned back to look at the basement one more time. I'm not sure why I did that, just habit, I suppose, making sure I hadn't forgot anything. The room looked different from that angle, longer and narrower than I remembered, with the far wall seeming much further away than it should have been. But basements can be deceiving, especially with poor lighting. The metal cabinet was still visible from the stairs, and I could see that bluish glow more clearly now. It was definitely coming from inside the cabinet, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. Though that's impossible, since there's no electrical connection to that area. It was probably just my eyes adjusting to the dim light, creating optical illusions. I climbed the rest of the stairs without looking back again. When I reached the top, I closed the basement door and turned the lock. We always keep it locked for safety reasons, though I can't remember us ever having a lock on that door before. It must have been installed recently for security purposes. The paper I had taken from the basement was still in my pocket when I got back to the main floor. I pulled it out to take another look, and I was surprised to see how detailed the diagrams were. The floor plan showed not just rooms and corridors, but also what looked like ventilation systems, electrical conduits, and small chambers marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The human figure in the smaller diagram had those same symbols marked at specific points: temples, wrists, ankles, and several spots along the spine. Each symbol was connected to the others by thin lines, creating a pattern that reminded me of circuit diagrams or maybe medical charts showing nerve pathways. But I folded the paper back up without studying it too carefully. Whatever it wasn't any of my business. I put it in the kitchen drawer with other miscellaneous papers, planning to throw it away with the regular trash pickup. Though when I checked the drawer later that evening, the paper wasn't there anymore. I must have absent-mindedly put it somewhere else. I slept well that night, no strange dreams or disturbances, though I did wake up once in the middle of the night with the odd sensation that someone was standing in my bedroom, watching me sleep. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty and dark, exactly as it should be. Just my imagination playing tricks on me in that half-awake state we all experience sometimes. The next morning I went about my normal routine without thinking about the basement incident at all. Why would I? Nothing unusual had happened, though I did notice that the basement door was standing slightly ajar when I passed it on my way to the kitchen. The lock must not have caught properly when I closed it the night before. I made sure to secure it properly this time, checking twice to ensure the lock was engaged. As I walked away, I thought I heard that same quiet humming sound I had noticed before, coming from somewhere below the floorboards, but it was probably just the water heater or some other household appliance cycling on. Later that day, I found the folded paper sitting on my bedside table, though I have no memory of putting it there. I must have carried it upstairs without thinking, the way you sometimes move objects around absent-mindedly when you're preoccupied with other thoughts. This time when I unfolded it, there were additional markings on the page that I hadn't noticed before. Small notations written in pencil along the margins, including what looked like measurements and calculations. The handwriting was neat and precise, definitely not my grandmother's shaky script that I remembered from her letters. Some of the notations were in a language I didn't recognize, though the characters looked almost familiar, like something I might have seen before but couldn't quite place. There were also several dates written in the corner, but the ink had faded too much for me to make them out clearly. I decided to put the paper back in the basement where I had found it. There was no point in keeping something I didn't understand, and it seemed wrong to throw away what might have been important to my grandmother. When I unlocked the basement door, I noticed the air felt different, warmer and more humid than before, with that same metallic scent I had noticed earlier. The overhead bulb was already on when I reached the bottom of the stairs, though I was certain I had turned it off the previous day. The switch must be faulty, or maybe it's connected to some automatic timer system I wasn't aware of. Old houses often have quirky electrical setups that don't make sense to modern homeowners. The metal cabinet was in the same position, but the lock was now hanging open on its chain. I definitely hadn't opened it before, and there was no reason anyone else would have been in the basement. The lock probably just worked itself loose over time. Those old mechanisms can be unreliable. I approached the cabinet cautiously, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to be respectful of my grandmother's belongings. When I pulled the door open, the hinges moved silently, as if they had been recently oiled. Inside, the cabinet was much deeper than it had appeared from the outside, extending back into what should have been solid foundation wall. The interior was lined with the same blue-gray material I had noticed on the walls the day before, and there were small lights embedded in the ceiling of the cabinet, providing that soft bluish illumination I had seen through the ventilation grate. The lights appeared to be connected to some kind of battery system, since there were no visible wires running to them. Along the back wall of the cabinet were several shelves holding items I couldn't immediately identify. They looked like scientific instruments of some kind, metal devices with glass components, digital displays that showed numbers I didn't understand, and what appeared to be recording equipment with small microphones and speakers. One of the devices was making that quiet humming sound I had heard before. When I leaned closer to examine it, the sound changed pitch slightly, as if responding to my presence. But that's probably just coincidence. Electronic equipment often makes different sounds depending on temperature and humidity levels. There was also a stack of papers similar to the one I had found the day before, but these were filled with handwritten notes and more of those detailed diagrams. The handwriting was the same neat script I had seen on the margins of my folded paper, definitely not my grandmother's writing. She must have been working with someone else on whatever project these documents related to. I picked up one of the papers to get a better look at it. The diagram on this page showed what looked like a three-dimensional map of the basement, but with additional rooms and passages that didn't correspond to the actual layout of the house. According to the drawing, there should be several more chambers extending beyond the foundation walls, connected by narrow tunnels. That's obviously impossible. I know the layout of this property, and there's nothing but solid earth beyond the basement walls. The diagram must be showing plans for expansion that were never carried out, or maybe it's a map of some completely different building that got mixed in with my grandmother's papers by mistake. But as I studied the drawing more carefully, I realized it showed details that matched the actual basement perfectly: the exact position of the stairs, the location of the water heater, even the spot where the metal cabinet was positioned. The only difference was those additional rooms that supposedly extended beyond the visible walls. According to the diagram, one of those hidden chambers was directly behind the cabinet I was standing in front of. The drawing showed a doorway in the back wall of the cabinet, leading to a circular room with symbols marked around the perimeter, the same symbols that appeared on the human figure diagram. I reached toward the back wall of the cabinet to see if there might actually be a hidden door there. The wall felt different from what I expected, not like concrete or wood, but more like metal or plastic, with a slight give to it when I pressed against it. And it was definitely warm, noticeably warmer than the air around it. When I pushed a little harder, a section of the wall moved inward with a soft clicking sound. Not like a door opening, but more like a panel sliding aside. Behind it was a narrow opening, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they turned sideways. I didn't go through the opening, of course. That would be dangerous and foolish. But I did lean forward to look inside, and I could see that it led to exactly the kind of circular chamber shown in the diagram. The walls were lined with that same blue-gray material, and there were small lights embedded in the ceiling providing dim illumination. Around the perimeter of the chamber were what looked like examination tables or beds, each one positioned beneath one of those symbols I had seen in the drawings. The tables appeared to be made of the same warm metal as the cabinet, with restraining straps attached at regular intervals. But I'm sure I'm misremembering what I saw. I was only looking for a few seconds, and the lighting was poor. They were probably just storage shelves or workbenches, perfectly innocent furniture that looked strange because of the unusual angle and shadows. I backed away from the opening and let the panel slide closed again. Whatever was back there, it wasn't any of my business. My grandmother obviously had her reasons for keeping it hidden, and I should respect her privacy even after her death. I put the papers back where I had found them and closed the cabinet door. The lock clicked into place automatically, which saved me the trouble of securing it manually. As I walked back toward the stairs, I noticed that the overhead bulb was flickering more rapidly than before, creating a strobe-like effect that made everything in the basement seem to move in slow motion. The shadows on the walls were definitely moving independently now, flowing across the surfaces in patterns that didn't match the flickering light. Some of them seemed to have shapes, elongated forms that looked almost like human silhouettes, but stretched and distorted in ways that made them appear otherworldly. But shadows can create all kinds of optical illusions, especially when combined with flickering light sources and tired eyes. I had been in the basement for longer than I intended, and I was probably experiencing some kind of sensory fatigue that was making me see things that weren't really there. I climbed the stairs quickly, not because I was frightened, but because I was eager to get back to the normal activities of my day. When I reached the top, I locked the basement door again and made a mental note to have an electrician look at that faulty light fixture soon. The folded paper was still in my hand when I got back to the kitchen. I had forgotten I was carrying it, which explains how it kept appearing in different locations around the house. This time I put it in a specific drawer and made sure to remember exactly where I had placed it. But when I checked the drawer an hour later, the paper had changed again. There were new markings on it, including what looked like a floor plan of the main level of my house. Every room was accurately depicted, down to the placement of furniture and fixtures. But there were also additional notations showing the locations of what the diagram labeled as monitoring stations. According to the markings, there were small devices hidden throughout the house, in air vents, behind electrical outlets, even inside the walls themselves. Each device was connected to the others by thin lines that led back to a central point in the basement, right where the metal cabinet was located. That's ridiculous, of course. There are no monitoring devices in my house. I would know if someone had installed surveillance equipment in my own home. The diagram must be showing the locations of normal household systems, smoke detectors, electrical wiring, maybe cable television connections. But that evening I started noticing small details I hadn't observed before. Tiny holes in the walls that could have been drilled for microphones. Electrical outlets that seemed newer than the rest of the house's fixtures. Air vents that appeared to have been recently cleaned or adjusted. When I looked closely at one of the vents, I could see what looked like a small lens or sensor mounted just inside the opening, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. But it was probably just part of the normal HVAC system, maybe a temperature sensor or air quality monitor that had been installed by previous owners. I decided to stop thinking about the basement and the strange papers I had found there. Whatever my grandmother had been involved in, it was finished now, and there was no point in letting my imagination run wild with conspiracy theories and paranoid fantasies. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that the basement door was standing open again. I was certain I had locked it securely after my visit earlier in the day. The lock mechanism must be more damaged than I realized, failing to engage properly even when it appears to be secured. I went to close it again, and as I reached for the door handle, I heard voices coming from somewhere below. Not loud voices, just quiet conversation between what sounded like 2 or 3 people. They were too far away for me to make out any words, but the tone seemed businesslike and professional, like colleagues discussing a work project. That's impossible, of course. No one else has access to my house, and there's no way anyone could have gotten into the basement without me knowing. The voices were probably coming from outside neighbors talking in their backyard, or maybe sound carrying from the street through some acoustic quirk of the house's construction. I closed the door firmly and engaged the lock, checking it twice to make sure it was properly secured. As I walked away, the voices stopped abruptly, as if whoever was talking had suddenly noticed my presence upstairs. But there was no one down there. I know that because I would have seen them when I was in the basement earlier. And besides, the only entrance to the basement is through the door I had just locked, so there's no way anyone could have gotten in or out without passing through the main floor of the house. I went to bed without investigating further. There was nothing to investigate after all, just ordinary house sounds that my tired mind had interpreted as human voices. Old buildings make all kinds of noises, especially at night when temperature changes cause materials to expand and contract. Though I did lie awake for a while, listening for any other sounds that might be coming from below. And I thought I heard them, not voices this time, but mechanical sounds like equipment being moved around, metal objects being placed on hard surfaces, electronic devices powering up with soft beeping noises. But I must have been dreaming, or in that half-asleep state where you can't distinguish between real sounds and imagined ones. Because when I got up in the morning, everything was perfectly quiet and normal. The basement door was locked exactly as I had left it. The folded paper was still in the kitchen drawer where I had placed it. There were no signs that anyone had been in the house during the night. Everything is completely normal now. I've decided to seal up the basement permanently and convert the space upstairs for storage instead. There's no reason to keep going down there, since there's nothing of value left to find. Though I should probably wait a few more days before calling the contractors, just to make sure I'm not overlooking anything important that might still be stored down there. And tonight I think I'll sleep with my bedroom door open, so I can hear if that basement door comes unlocked again. Story 6. The vacuum's hum ceased as I clicked it off. The fibers beneath my bare feet felt strangely uneven, each step whispering secrets the room should not have held. I rubbed my thumb over the woven threads, tracing something that wasn't there before. A chill crept over my skin, and the air seemed to stand still, waiting. What had shifted eluded me, yet the atmosphere had changed, like an unfinished sentence lingering without pause. I know now that this moment marks the end of everything familiar. The texture under my fingers speaks a language I never wanted to learn. The carpet holds impressions that shouldn't exist, patterns that form when I'm not looking directly at them. My reflection in the darkened window shows someone I barely recognize anymore. The person staring back has eyes that have seen too much, skin that remembers touches from things that weren't quite there. The cleaning was meant to erase what happened, but some stains work their way deeper than the surface. Some marks become part of the foundation itself. Before the vacuum, before the desperate attempt to restore normalcy, I stood in this same spot watching the last visitor leave. The door had closed with a sound like breaking glass, though the wood remained intact. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway longer than they should have, each impact seeming to reverberate through the walls themselves. I had pressed my palm against the door after they left, feeling vibrations that didn't match any movement in the building. The wood was warm, almost feverish, and when I pulled my hand away, the outline remained visible for several heartbeats. The air tasted metallic, like pennies left too long in a closed fist. The visitor's presence lingered in ways that defied logic. Their scent clung to the furniture, but it wasn't perfume or cologne. It was something deeper, more primal. The smell of earth after heavy rain mixed with the copper tang of old pipes. Every surface they had touched retained a subtle wrongness, as if their contact had altered the molecular structure of ordinary things. I found myself avoiding those spots without conscious thought, walking around chairs they had sat in, steering clear of the doorframe they had leaned against. My body knew something my mind refused to acknowledge. The conversation itself had been unremarkable on the surface. We discussed mundane topics while seated across from each other in the living room. But underneath the ordinary words, something else was being communicated. A secondary dialogue that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to the primitive parts of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey. They had smiled at appropriate moments, nodded when expected, maintained eye contact within normal parameters. Yet every gesture felt rehearsed, as if they were following a script written by someone who had only observed human behavior from a distance. The timing was just slightly off, like a film where the audio sync has drifted by a few frames. Their questions seemed innocent enough, inquiries about my daily routine, my sleep patterns, whether I lived alone. Standard small talk between acquaintances. But the way they absorbed my answers suggested these details held significance I couldn't grasp. They filed away each piece of information with the careful attention of someone building a map. When they asked to use the restroom, I directed them down the hall. The floorboards creaked under their weight in a rhythm that didn't match their visible steps. I counted the sounds and found too many, as if they were accompanied by someone I couldn't see. The bathroom door closed with a soft click, but I never heard it open again. Somehow they reappeared in the living room without any transitional noise. The wrongness had started even before they arrived. I remember now the anticipation that built throughout that afternoon, a growing sense that something significant was approaching. The light coming through the windows seemed different, more angular somehow, casting shadows that bent in directions that defied the sun's position. I had been cleaning obsessively, though the apartment was already spotless. My hands moved without conscious direction, wiping down surfaces that showed no dust, straightening objects that were already perfectly aligned. The repetitive motions felt ritualistic, as if I were preparing for a ceremony I didn't understand. The knock, when it finally came, was both expected and completely startling. 3 measured raps, evenly spaced, with a hollow quality that suggested the person outside wasn't using their knuckles. I approached the door with my heart hammering against my ribs, though I couldn't explain why a simple visitor should inspire such dread. Through the peephole they appeared perfectly normal. Average height, unremarkable clothing, a pleasant expression that suggested no threat. But the fisheye lens seemed to struggle with their image, creating distortions that shifted when I moved my head. Sometimes they appeared slightly blurred around the edges, as if they weren't quite solid. Other times the distortion made them seem too sharp, more defined than the hallway around them. I hesitated with my hand on the deadbolt, every instinct screaming warnings I couldn't articulate. The rational part of my mind insisted there was nothing wrong with the scene outside my door. People visit other people all the time. This was normal human interaction, but my body remained frozen, caught between social obligation and primitive terror. The knocking came again, the same 3 measured impacts. This time I noticed that the sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if the person outside was somehow knocking on several surfaces simultaneously. The door, the walls, perhaps even the floor beneath my feet. The vibrations traveled through the building's structure in ways that suggested the visitor's presence extended beyond their visible form. But even before the knock, before the afternoon of obsessive cleaning, there had been signs. Subtle alterations in my environment that I had dismissed as products of stress or imagination. Objects that seemed to have moved slightly when I wasn't looking. Shadows that lingered a moment too long after their sources had passed. The persistent feeling of being observed, even when I was completely alone. My sleep had become restless, filled with dreams that felt more like memories of events I had never experienced. I would wake with the taste of copper in my mouth and the sensation that someone had been whispering in my ear while I slept. The pillow beside me would sometimes hold an indentation that couldn't be explained by my own movement during the night. The building itself seemed to be changing. Hallways that I had walked hundreds of times appeared longer or shorter depending on my state of mind. The elevator would sometimes stop at floors that didn't exist, opening to reveal empty shafts or walls of raw concrete. Other tenants began avoiding eye contact, hurrying past with their heads down as if they were afraid of what they might see in my face. The maintenance requests I submitted were never acknowledged. Flickering lights remained unfixed, dripping faucets continued their irregular rhythm, and the heating system produced sounds that resembled whispered conversations in a language I couldn't identify. The building management claimed to have no record of my complaints, though I had submitted them multiple times through proper channels. My reflection in mirrors and windows started showing inconsistencies. Sometimes the image would lag behind my movements by a fraction of a second. Other times it would move independently, turning its head to look at things I wasn't seeing or mouthing words I wasn't speaking. I began avoiding reflective surfaces, but they seemed to multiply, appearing in unexpected places where they had never been before. The changes in my environment were accompanied by alterations in my own perception. Colors appeared more saturated in some areas and completely drained in others, as if reality itself was developing dead zones. Sounds became layered, with familiar noises carrying undertones of things that shouldn't exist. The hum of electrical appliances contained fragments of music played on instruments I couldn't identify. My sense of time began to deteriorate. Minutes would stretch into hours, while entire afternoons would pass in what felt like moments. I would start a simple task like making coffee and find myself standing in the kitchen hours later with no memory of the intervening time. The coffee would be cold in the cup, suggesting I had completed the task, but I retained no awareness of having done so. The phone calls started during this period, always at the same time, always lasting exactly the same duration, always ending with the same abrupt disconnection. The caller never spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a presence that felt massive and patient, like something vast listening from the other end of an impossibly long tunnel. I began to screen my calls, but the phone would ring even when it was unplugged. The sound would come from inside the walls or from appliances that had no capacity to produce such noise. Sometimes I would answer these phantom calls and hear my own voice speaking words I had never said, having conversations I couldn't remember. But the true beginning, the moment when everything started to unravel, was simpler than I could have imagined. I trace it back to a single decision, a moment of curiosity that seemed completely harmless at the time. I had found something small while taking out the trash, a piece of paper folded into a complex pattern that hurt to look at directly. The creases formed shapes that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. It had been tucked behind the dumpster, as if someone had hidden it there deliberately. The rational thing would have been to leave it alone, to continue with my mundane task and forget I had ever seen it. But something about the precise nature of the folds drew my attention. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this object. The paper itself was unusual, with a texture that felt organic despite its manufactured appearance. I picked it up. The moment my fingers made contact with the folded paper, something fundamental changed in the world around me. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with the subtle certainty of a door closing somewhere in the distance. The change was so small that I almost missed it entirely, just a slight shift in the quality of light, a barely perceptible alteration in the way sound traveled through the air. But I had crossed a threshold without realizing it. The simple act of touching that carefully folded paper had sent a signal into systems I didn't know existed, announcing my presence to things that had been waiting patiently for someone exactly like me to make exactly that choice. The paper felt warm in my hands, almost alive, and as I turned it over to examine the intricate pattern of folds, I caught a glimpse of something that might have been writing on the interior surfaces. Not words in any language I recognized, but symbols that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. I should have put it back. I should have walked away and forgotten the entire incident. But curiosity had already taken hold, and the paper seemed to pulse with a subtle energy that made it impossible to ignore. I carried it back to my apartment, unaware that I was bringing something into my home that would gradually transform everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality itself. That was the beginning, a moment of innocent curiosity that opened a door I didn't know existed and couldn't figure out how to close. Everything that followed, every strange occurrence and inexplicable change, could be traced back to that single decision to pick up a piece of folded paper from behind a dumpster. Now standing here with the vacuum silent at my feet and the carpet whispering secrets beneath my bare skin, I understand that some doors once opened can never be closed again. Some choices echo forward through time, creating ripples that eventually become waves, and waves that eventually become tsunamis of consequence. The paper is gone now, dissolved or transformed or simply moved on to wait for the next curious person to discover it. But its influence remains, woven into the very fabric of my existence like a thread that, once pulled, unravels everything it touches. I am the effect of that cause, the final result of a process that began with the simple human impulse to investigate something unusual. And now I know that somewhere else, someone else is probably making that same choice, picking up something they shouldn't touch, opening a door they can't close. The cycle continues as it always has, as it always will. And I am no longer entirely sure which side of the door I'm standing on. Story 7. I had just switched off the coffee maker, and the aroma lingered like a fading memory. My fingers brushed over the smooth countertop, feeling an unexpected warmth beneath the cool surface. The refrigerator hummed softly, a familiar presence that now seemed oddly intrusive. I noticed the slight change in temperature as if the air had shifted its weight, unsettling, almost sentient. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, but something in its rhythm felt unfamiliar. That memory comes back to me now, sitting here thousands of miles away from that place. I've been carrying this story inside me for years, turning it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by constant handling. I told myself I'd never speak about it, that some things are better left buried, but the weight of keeping it secret has become unbearable. My voice shakes even now as I begin to tell you what happened. I need you to understand that I'm not the same person I was before. Something fundamental changed in me during those weeks, something that distance and time haven't been able to heal. I've moved across the country since then, built a new life, surrounded myself with different sounds and smells and rhythms. Yet I can still feel it clinging to me, like smoke in fabric that won't wash clean. The house where it all began was unremarkable. A rental property in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happens. I'd taken it for the summer while working on a research project, needing solitude and silence to focus. The neighbors were distant but friendly, the streets lined with old trees that filtered sunlight into gentle patterns on the pavement. It felt safe, ordinary, forgettable. For the first few weeks, everything was exactly as it should be. I fell into a comfortable routine: morning coffee in that kitchen, long hours at my desk, evening walks around the block. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs. I learned its sounds the way you learn a new language, unconsciously cataloging each noise until it became part of the background of my daily life. But memory is a strange thing. Looking back now, I wonder if the signs were there from the beginning, so subtle that my conscious mind dismissed them while something deeper took note. The way shadows fell at angles that didn't quite match the position of the sun. The faint metallic taste that would sometimes coat my tongue when I first woke up. The feeling, just at the edge of perception, that I was being observed. I remember the first time I really noticed something was wrong. I was working late one evening, the only light coming from my laptop screen and a small desk lamp. The house was quiet except for the usual settling sounds and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it, a low tone, almost below the range of hearing, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it was a truck passing on the highway, or maybe construction equipment from a nearby site. But as I listened, I realized the sound was coming from inside the house itself. It pulsed gently, rising and falling like a slow heartbeat. When I got up to investigate, moving from room to room with growing unease, the sound seemed to follow me, always just beyond the next doorway. I found nothing, no obvious source, no mechanical explanation. By the time I returned to my desk, the humming had stopped. I convinced myself it was the air conditioning system cycling on or pipes expanding in the walls. Old houses make strange noises. I went back to work, but concentration felt impossible. The silence that replaced the humming seemed heavier than before, pregnant with possibility. Over the following days, the incidents multiplied. Electronic devices began behaving erratically. My laptop would dim and brighten its screen without input from me, as if something was adjusting the display from within. The television would turn itself on in the middle of the night, always tuned to static, the white noise filling the house like whispered conversations in a language I couldn't understand. I started keeping a journal of these occurrences, thinking that documenting them might reveal a pattern or help me identify a rational cause. But reading back through those entries now, I can see how my handwriting gradually changed, becoming more hurried and angular, as if my hand was struggling to keep up with thoughts that moved too quickly for comfort. The smell appeared around the third week, sweet but with an underlying metallic note like copper pennies dissolved in honey. It would manifest suddenly, filling a room for just a few seconds before vanishing completely. I would follow it from space to space, but it was always gone by the time I arrived, leaving only the faintest trace in my memory. My sleep became fractured and strange. I would wake at odd hours with the absolute certainty that someone had been speaking to me, but I could never remember the words. Sometimes I found myself standing in different rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there, as if I'd been sleepwalking through conversations I couldn't recall. The mirrors began to trouble me most of all, not because they showed me anything that shouldn't be there, but because of what they didn't show. My reflection would lag just slightly behind my movements, creating a disorienting sense that I was watching myself from outside my own body. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of motion in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except my own face staring back with eyes that seemed somehow unfamiliar. I told myself I was working too hard, sleeping too little. Isolation can play tricks on the mind, I reasoned. The human brain, deprived of regular social interaction, begins to create stimuli where none exist. I tried to rationalize each incident, to find logical explanations that would restore my sense of normalcy. But deep down, in a place beyond rational thought, I knew something was fundamentally wrong. The house felt different now, as if its very architecture had shifted in ways too subtle for my eyes to detect, but profound enough for my body to sense. Walking through familiar rooms felt like navigating a maze where the walls had moved just slightly out of true. The key moment came on a night when the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep but not fully awake, when I felt a pressure on my chest like invisible hands pressing down. The sensation was so real, so physical, that I gasped and sat up, heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty, of course, but as I looked around, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of being touched by something that wasn't there, I noticed that every electronic device in the house was glowing. Not turned on exactly, but emanating a soft phosphorescence that had nothing to do with their normal operation. The digital clock, the smoke detector, even the thermostat on the wall, all pulsing in perfect synchronization like a network of artificial hearts. I watched in fascination and growing terror as the lights began to shift frequency, cycling through colors that seemed to exist just outside the normal spectrum of human vision. The humming sound returned, louder now, no longer trying to hide itself. It filled the house from foundation to roof, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. That's when I saw it, not a shape or figure, nothing so concrete as that, but a presence, a distortion in the air itself, moving through the room like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. It paused near the foot of my bed, and I felt its attention focus on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl with goosebumps despite the warm night air. We regarded each other across that impossible space between the known and unknowable. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except lie there paralyzed by a terror so complete it felt like drowning in thick liquid. But I couldn't move, couldn't even close my eyes. I could only watch as the distortion slowly circled the bed, studying me with what felt like scientific curiosity. The moment stretched endlessly, seconds becoming hours in my perception. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights went dark, the humming ceased, and I was alone again in ordinary darkness, but the feeling of being observed remained, stronger than ever. I left the next morning, packed my essential belongings into my car and drove away without looking back, abandoning my research project and the remainder of my lease. I told myself I was being practical, that the isolation had affected my mental state, and I needed to return to civilization for my own well-being. But even as I put miles between myself and that house, I knew I hadn't really escaped. The thing I'd encountered, whatever it was, had marked me in some fundamental way. I could feel its presence like a splinter buried too deep to remove, a constant awareness that I was no longer entirely alone in my own mind. The years that followed were an exercise in building walls around that experience. I found work in a bustling city, surrounded myself with noise and light and the constant movement of human activity. I convinced myself that urban energy would drown out whatever had followed me from that quiet house. Sometimes it worked. Days would pass when I felt almost normal, when the memory seemed like nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. But then I would catch a reflection moving wrong in a storefront window, or smell that sweet metallic scent in a crowded subway car, and I would know that distance meant nothing to whatever had found me. My dreams became territories I could no longer claim as my own. Night after night, I would find myself back in that house, walking through rooms that had somehow multiplied and expanded beyond their original dimensions. The presence would be there waiting, patient and persistent, continuing whatever examination it had begun that last night. I wake from these dreams with the taste of copper in my mouth and the absolute certainty that something has been whispering to me in languages that predate human speech. My body bears no marks, shows no signs of interference, yet I feel fundamentally altered each morning, as if pieces of myself have been carefully removed and replaced with something else. The worst part is the growing suspicion that the encounter was not random, that I was chosen for reasons I cannot comprehend. Sometimes I catch myself speaking words I don't remember learning, or finding my hands moving in gestures that feel significant but whose meaning eludes me. I am becoming something other than what I was, transformed by contact with something that exists in the spaces between what we consider real. I've tried therapy, medication, every rational approach to healing that modern medicine offers. But how do you explain to a professional that you've been marked by something that shouldn't exist? How do you describe the sensation of being slowly hollowed out and refilled with someone else's purpose? So I carry this story alone, as I've carried it all these years. Speaking it aloud now feels like breaking a seal that was never meant to be broken, like inviting something back into a life I've worked so hard to rebuild. But the weight of silence has become unbearable, and perhaps there's some relief in finally admitting what I know to be true. I am not the same person who walked into that house years ago. Whatever I am becoming, the process began that night when I felt invisible hands upon my chest and saw the air itself bend around a presence that noticed me noticing it. The transformation continues still, patient and inexorable, changing me in ways I can sense but not understand. Even now, as I finish telling you this story, I can feel it stirring in response to my words. The temperature in this room has dropped several degrees, and there's a familiar metallic taste creeping across my tongue. The lights are beginning to flicker in that old rhythm, and I know with absolute certainty that speaking about it has only made it stronger. I thought distance would protect me. I thought silence would keep me safe. But some connections once made cannot be severed by geography or time. I am still in that house, and that house is still in me, and the thing that found me there continues its slow work of remaking me into something I was never meant to be. The humming has started again. Story 8. The morning air carried a crisp chill, seeping through the half-opened window in the dimly lit room. A clock ticked rhythmically on the mantel, yet the echo of its chime felt oddly distant. On the floor, a thin layer of dust danced in the golden shafts of light, marred only by a single, conspicuously clean spot. The door stood ajar, whispering secrets into the silence as the unease lingered, thick and heavy, like a shadow that refused to settle. I remember that room, or do I? The memory feels borrowed, like someone else's photograph pressed into my palm. I've been trying to piece together what happened to me. The doctors say trauma can fragment things, scatter them like broken glass across the floor of your mind. Some pieces cut deep when you try to pick them up, others just crumble to dust. There's this sound that keeps coming back to me, a low hum, almost electrical but organic somehow. It vibrates behind my teeth, makes my jaw ache. I hear it when I'm falling asleep, when I'm brushing my hair, when I'm standing in the shower letting the water run cold down my spine. The sound doesn't belong to any machine I know. It's too alive for that. My hands shake when I write this. They've been shaking for weeks now, maybe months. Time feels elastic, unreliable. The tremor starts in my fingertips and travels up through my wrists, my arms, until my whole body feels like it's vibrating at that same frequency as the hum, the frequency that shouldn't exist. I was wearing a blue sweater, cotton, with tiny pills along the sleeves where the fabric had worn thin. The texture was important somehow. I remember running my thumb across those little bumps over and over like a prayer or a ritual. The sweater smelled like lavender detergent and something else. something metallic and sharp that made my sinuses burn. There was someone with me. Their footsteps echoed differently than mine, heavier on the left side. A slight limp maybe, or just an uneven gait. I can hear those footsteps in my dreams, always approaching but never quite arriving. The sound bounces off walls I can't see, in spaces that feel too large and too small at the same time. The clean spot on the floor bothers me more than it should. Everything else was covered in dust, months or years of neglect, but that one patch was spotless, perfectly circular, about the size of a dinner plate. The wood underneath was darker, like it had been stained or burned. When I knelt to touch it, my fingers came away damp. Not wet, just damp, like morning dew or condensation from breath. I keep losing track of which memories are real. Did I really kneel on that floor, or am I imagining it now? The feeling of the wood grain under my palm seems too vivid to be false, but then again, so does the memory of flying. Not in a plane or with wings, just floating up toward a ceiling that kept receding, stretching away from me like taffy. The light coming through that window wasn't quite right. Golden, yes, but with an underlying green tint that made everything look sickly. It reminded me of the light in hospital rooms, fluorescent and harsh despite its softness. My skin looked wrong in that light, too pale and somehow translucent. I could see the blue veins in my wrists pulsing in time with that persistent hum. There was a photograph on the mantel next to the clock. I'm certain of this detail, even though I can't remember what the picture showed. A family maybe, or a landscape, something important enough to frame but generic enough to forget. The glass was cracked down the middle, dividing whatever image it held into two unequal halves. The crack looked fresh, like it had happened recently, but there were no glass fragments on the floor below. My mouth tasted like copper pennies and burnt coffee. The taste lingered for days, weeks, coating my tongue no matter how much I brushed my teeth or rinsed with mouthwash. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night with that metallic flavor so strong it made me gag. I'd stumble to the bathroom and spit into the sink, expecting to see blood, but there was never anything there. Just clear saliva and the persistent taste of something wrong. The person with the uneven footsteps spoke to me, but I can't recall the words. Their voice was familiar, like someone I'd known for years, but distorted somehow. Too deep or too high, like a recording played at the wrong speed. They kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Simple questions that should have been easy, but the words wouldn't form in my mouth. My tongue felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from my thoughts. I remember touching the door frame as I left that room. The wood was warm, almost hot, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight all day. But the room was dim, remember. That sickly golden-green light barely illuminated the corners. So why was the wood so warm? My palm stuck to it slightly, like touching skin on a humid day. When I pulled my hand away, I left a perfect handprint behind. 5 fingers and a thumb pressed into the wood grain like it was soft clay. The hallway beyond the door stretched in both directions, longer than seemed possible. The walls were covered in wallpaper with a pattern I couldn't quite focus on. Flowers, maybe, or geometric shapes that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. The carpet under my feet was thick and soft, muffling the sound of my footsteps, but somehow amplifying that person's uneven gait behind me. There was a mirror at the end of the hallway. I'm sure of this because I walked toward it for what felt like hours without getting any closer. My reflection looked back at me, but it was doing things I wasn't doing, raising its hand when mine was at my side, turning its head when I was looking straight ahead. The person behind me cast no reflection at all, just an empty space where they should have been. The smell of overheated electronics filled the air. You know that scent, sharp and acrid, like when a computer overheats or a television shorts out. It burned the inside of my nose and made my eyes water. But there were no electronics in that hallway, no outlets or wires or anything that could produce that smell. just wallpaper and carpet and the endless stretch toward a mirror that reflected lies. My clothes felt wrong against my skin, not just the blue sweater, but everything. My jeans were too tight around the waist, but too loose in the legs. My socks bunched up inside my shoes with every step. The fabric of my underwear chafed in places it had never chafed before, like my body had changed shape while I wasn't paying attention. I kept tugging at the sweater, trying to make it sit right, but it never did. The hum grew louder as I walked, or maybe I was getting closer to its source. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the studs and insulation, making the wallpaper flutter slightly. I pressed my ear against the wall and felt the vibration in my skull, behind my eyes, in the hollow spaces of my sinuses. It was almost like a heartbeat, but too fast and too regular. I think I fell down at some point. My knees were scraped and my palms were dirty when I looked at them later. The scrapes were fresh, still bleeding slightly, but I couldn't remember hitting the ground. One moment I was walking toward the impossible mirror, the next I was on my hands and knees on carpet that smelled like dust and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. The person with uneven footsteps helped me up. Their hands were cold, so cold they burned where they touched my arms. Through the sleeves of the blue sweater, I could feel the chill spreading across my skin like frostbite, but their grip was gentle, careful, like they were afraid I might break, or like they were afraid they might break me. There was a door I hadn't noticed before, heavy wood, painted white but chipped around the edges. No doorknob, just a smooth surface where a handle should have been. The paint was fresh in some places and old in others, like someone had tried to touch it up but hadn't matched the color quite right. Light leaked from underneath it, brighter than the hallway but somehow dimmer than it should have been. I wanted to touch that door. The urge was overwhelming, like an itch I couldn't scratch. My fingers tingled with the need to press against that smooth white surface to feel whatever warmth or coldness lay beyond. But every time I reached for it, my hand stopped just short, like there was an invisible barrier in the air. My fingertips would tingle and go numb, and I'd have to pull my hand back. The person behind me was breathing heavily now, not from exertion, but from something else, fear, maybe, or anticipation. Their breath was warm against the back of my neck, but it smelled wrong, metallic like blood, but also sweet, like candy or medicine. Each exhale made the fine hairs on my neck stand up, and I could feel goosebumps spreading down my arms despite the warmth of the blue sweater. I think that's when things started to fragment, not just my memory of events, but reality itself. The hallway began to stretch and compress like an accordion. The mirror at the end would suddenly be right in front of me, then impossibly far away again. The door with no handle appeared and disappeared, sometimes on my left, sometimes on my right, once directly overhead like a skylight. My reflection in the mirror was doing more than just moving independently now. It was aging and growing younger in rapid cycles, child to adult to elderly and back again, over and over, while I stood perfectly still. Its clothes changed too, from the blue sweater to a hospital gown to something I didn't recognize. Something that looked like it was made of the same material as the wallpaper, covered in that shifting pattern I couldn't quite focus on. The clean spot from the first room appeared on the hallway carpet. The same perfect circle, the same dark stain underneath, the same damp feeling when I knelt to touch it. But this time, when I pulled my hand away, my palm was stained with something dark. Not quite black, not quite red, but the color of dried blood mixed with motor oil. I tried to wipe my hand on my jeans, but the stain wouldn't come off. It seemed to sink deeper into my skin with each attempt to clean it, until it looked like a birthmark or a tattoo. The mark was warm, warmer than the rest of my body, and it pulsed in rhythm with that persistent hum that had been following me since the beginning. The person with uneven footsteps was crying now. I could hear the soft, wet sounds of tears, but when I turned around, they weren't there. Just an empty hallway stretching back the way I'd come, wallpaper shifting and changing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But the crying continued, echoing off walls that seemed to absorb every other sound. That's when I noticed my own footsteps had become uneven too. My left foot was dragging slightly, creating the same rhythm I'd been hearing behind me. Had I been following myself this whole time? Had the person with the limp been my own shadow, somehow separated and walking independently? The thought made my stomach turn, but it felt true in a way that logic couldn't explain. The blue sweater was unraveling. I looked down to see threads pulling loose from the cuffs, creating long strings that trailed behind me as I walked. But instead of making the sweater smaller, the unraveling seemed to make it larger, the sleeves growing longer, the body becoming looser and more shapeless. Soon I was drowning in blue cotton, the fabric covering my hands completely, making it hard to move my arms. The light under the door without a handle was pulsing now, in sync with the hum and the warm spot on my palm. Each pulse sent shadows racing along the hallway walls, creating the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. Things that might have been people or furniture or something else entirely, always just out of sight when I turned to look directly. I realized I was holding something in my other hand, something small and hard and warm, like a stone that had been sitting in sunlight. But when I tried to look at it, my vision would blur or my eyes would water, or the object would seem to shift and change shape. Sometimes it felt smooth, sometimes rough. Sometimes it had sharp edges that cut into my palm, sometimes it was soft like clay or flesh. The mirror was directly in front of me now, close enough to touch. My reflection looked back, but it wasn't moving independently anymore. Instead, it was perfectly synchronized with my movements, but wrong somehow. Like looking at myself through water or thick glass. My face was distorted, features stretched and compressed in ways that should have been impossible but looked almost natural. Behind my reflection, I could see the room where this all started. The dusty floor, the ticking clock, the half-opened window with its sickly light. But in the mirror version, the clean spot on the floor was occupied. Someone was lying there perfectly still, arms and legs arranged in an unnatural position. I couldn't see their face, but they were wearing a blue sweater just like mine. The person on the floor wasn't breathing. I pressed my face against the mirror, trying to see more clearly, and my breath fogged the glass. When the fog cleared, the figure was gone, but the clean spot remained, darker now, more obviously stained with what looked like scorch marks around the edges. I think that's when I understood, not completely, not with the clarity that comes with normal memory, but with the sick certainty that settles in your stomach when you realize something terrible has happened. The room, the hallway, the mirror, the person with uneven footsteps, they were all connected to something I'd done or something that had been done to me. The object in my hand was getting warmer, hot enough now that it should have burned, but instead it felt comforting, like a hand warmer on a cold day. I finally managed to look at it directly, fighting through the blurring and the tears. It was a key, old brass, worn smooth from handling, with teeth that looked like they'd been filed by hand rather than machine cut. The door without a handle was right beside me now. I hadn't seen it move, but there it was, close enough to touch. The light underneath was so bright it hurt to look at, but I couldn't look away. My hand with the key was moving toward the door, guided by some instinct or compulsion I couldn't control. But there was still no keyhole, just smooth white paint and the overwhelming brightness leaking from underneath. I pressed the key against different spots on the door, searching for some hidden lock, some way to make sense of what I was supposed to do. The key grew hotter in my hand, hot enough now that it should have burned, but my skin remained unmarked. That's where my memory fragments completely. I have flashes after that point, but they don't connect to anything coherent. The smell of burnt metal, the sound of something heavy falling, a sensation like drowning but in air instead of water, pain in my chest, sharp and sudden, then nothing. I woke up in a different place entirely. White walls, white ceiling, white sheets, the smell of disinfectant and floor wax, voices in the hallway speaking in low, professional tones. My hand was bandaged, the palm wrapped in gauze that smelled like antiseptic. When I asked what had happened to me, they said I'd been found unconscious. They said I'd been alone. But I still have the key. It's sitting on the table next to my bed right now, brass dulled with age and handling. Sometimes it gets warm again, usually late at night when the hospital is quiet and the fluorescent lights hum with that familiar frequency. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room, uneven and familiar, but when I look out, there's no one there. The doctors say my memory will come back gradually. They say trauma can create false memories, make you believe things happened that never did. They say the mind protects itself by creating elaborate fantasies to mask whatever really occurred, but they can't explain the key. They can't explain the stain on my palm that won't wash off, shaped like a perfect circle. I've been writing this down because I'm afraid I'll forget again. Not the way trauma makes you forget, but the way dreams fade when you wake up. Already some of the details are becoming fuzzy around the edges. The color of the wallpaper, the exact sound of the uneven footsteps, the temperature of that strange light. But the hum is getting stronger. I can hear it now even during the day, vibrating through the hospital walls, making the windows rattle in their frames. The other patients don't seem to notice, but I can see it affecting them. They move differently, speak in slightly altered rhythms, their eyes tracking something just out of sight. The key is warm again, warmer than it's been since I woke up here, and there's a door at the end of this hallway that I swear wasn't there yesterday. Heavy wood, painted white, with light leaking from underneath. No handle that I can see. I think something is waking up, something that was sleeping while I was broken, waiting for the pieces to fall back into place. The memories are getting clearer, more insistent, demanding to be remembered in full. And I'm starting to understand that what happened to me in that room, in that impossible hallway, isn't over. It's just beginning again, story 9. I was seated in the dim room, eyes fixed on the lone bulb above. It held its glow without the slightest tremor, casting stark, motionless shadows on the walls. Despite the stillness, a sense of encroachment pressed in like a whisper just beyond hearing. The air felt thick, an unwelcome presence that lingered at the edge of perception, never fully revealing itself. My gaze settled on a shadow in the corner, a patch of darker darkness that seemed to breathe in rhythm with my own. And then, where the silence had reigned, a soft rustle ruptured the air. Something new had entered the room. I know now that this is where it ends, where I end. The rustling grows closer, and I understand that whatever I've been waiting for has finally arrived. My hands rest motionless on my knees, and I feel a strange peace settling over me like dust on an abandoned shelf. There's no point in turning around. I already know what's behind me, even though I can't quite remember how I learned it. The knowledge sits heavy in my chest, a weight that's been growing heavier with each backward step through my memories. The bulb above me flickers once, just once, and in that brief interruption of light, I see my reflection in the window across the room. My face looks older than it should, worn thin like paper held too close to flame. But it's my eyes that disturb me most. They hold the look of someone who's seen the ending before the beginning, who's lived the conclusion without understanding the story. I close them now and let myself drift backward. The chair wasn't always positioned this way. I remember now, just before the final moment, I had dragged it across the floor. The legs scraped against the wooden boards with a sound like fingernails on bark. I positioned it carefully, precisely in the center of the room, equidistant from each wall. The mathematics of it felt important then, though I couldn't say why. My movements had been deliberate, almost ritualistic, each step measured, each gesture considered. I tested the chair's stability by pressing down on the seat with both palms, feeling for any wobble or weakness. Satisfied, I sat down and arranged my hands on my knees, fingers spread wide against the fabric of my pants. The bulb had been steady then too, but the shadows were different. They moved slightly, shifting as I settled into position. I watched them adjust to my presence, the way they stretched and contracted like living things finding their new shapes around me. The corner shadow, the one that would later seem to breathe, was smaller then, just a normal convergence of walls and darkness. I had been waiting for something, though I couldn't name what. The anticipation thrummed through me like electricity through copper wire. My skin felt sensitive, aware of every current of air, every minute change in temperature. The house around me creaked and settled, and I listened to each sound as if it might be a signal, a code I was meant to decipher. But before that, before the careful positioning and the waiting, there was movement, frantic movement. I had been pacing back and forth across the room, my feet wearing a path in the dust that had accumulated on the floor. The dust showed my pattern clearly, a rectangle of disturbance in the otherwise undisturbed layer of neglect. How long had I been pacing? The ache in my legs suggested hours, maybe longer. My hands shook as I walked, not from fear exactly, but from something deeper. A cellular trembling, as if my body was trying to vibrate itself apart at the molecular level. I pressed my palms together, interlaced my fingers, squeezed until the knuckles went white. It didn't help. The window drew my attention repeatedly during this pacing. I would walk toward it, stop just short of looking out, then turn away. Something about the view outside filled me with a dread I couldn't articulate. Not what I might see, but what might see me. The glass reflected the room behind me, doubled the shadows, made everything seem deeper and more layered than it should be. I remember touching my face during one of these passes, feeling the stubble that had grown there. My skin was clammy, cold despite the warmth of the room. When had I last eaten? The question seemed important, but I couldn't grasp the answer. Time had become slippery, unreliable. Moments stretched like taffy while hours compressed into heartbeats. The pacing had started after I heard the sound from upstairs. It wasn't a loud sound, in fact, it was barely perceptible. A soft thump like something small dropping onto carpet, but in the profound silence of the house, it might as well have been thunder. I had frozen in place, every muscle locked, listening for a repetition that never came. The house had been empty, I was certain of this. I had checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. The certainty sat solid in my mind like a stone in still water. Empty, definitely empty. But the sound came from above, from the bedroom at the end of the hall. The one with the door I had closed but not locked. Why hadn't I locked it? The question gnawed at me as I stood at the bottom of the stairs, hand gripping the banister, knuckles white with pressure. I didn't go up to investigate. Something in my bones told me not to. Instead, I backed away from the stairs, never taking my eyes off the landing above. The darkness up there seemed thicker than it should be, more substantial. It pooled at the top of the steps like black water held back by an invisible dam. That's when the pacing started. That's when my body began its restless circuit of the room, wearing away the dust, marking time with footsteps while my mind tried to process what I'd heard, or thought I'd heard. The distinction was becoming less clear. Before the sound, there had been the search. Room by room, methodical and thorough. I started with the ground floor, checking behind furniture, inside cabinets, even looking up at the ceiling for any signs of disturbance. The house felt wrong somehow, like a familiar song played in a different key. Everything was where it should be, but nothing felt right. The kitchen first. I opened every cabinet door, pulled out drawers, even checked inside the refrigerator, though logic told me no one could hide there. The refrigerator hummed quietly, the only sound in the house besides my own breathing and footsteps. Its light cast a cold blue glow across my face as I peered inside, illuminating shelves that held only condiments and expired milk. The living room next. I moved the couch away from the wall, looked behind the television stand, even lifted the cushions, though they were clearly undisturbed. The fireplace drew my attention. Cold ashes filled the grate, and I stirred them with a poker, looking for what I couldn't say. The metal clinked against brick, a sharp sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. Each room revealed nothing and everything. Nothing concrete, nothing I could point to and say, there, that's wrong. But everything felt contaminated somehow, as if an invisible presence had moved through these spaces before me, leaving no trace except a lingering wrongness that clung to the air like smoke. The bathroom was the worst. I avoided it initially, saving it for last, but when I finally forced myself to look, the mirror above the sink stopped me cold. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. For just a moment, just the briefest fraction of a second, my reflection seemed delayed. I moved my hand, and the reflection followed a heartbeat later, like an echo made of light and glass. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Normal. My reflection moved with me perfectly, synchronously. But the feeling remained, the sense that something had been just slightly out of phase, just slightly wrong. The upstairs search was more hurried, less thorough. By then the wrongness had gotten into my bones, made my skin crawl with invisible insects. I checked the bedrooms quickly, opening closet doors and looking under beds with the perfunctory gestures of someone going through motions rather than conducting a real search. But I was searching for something or someone. The certainty of this sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. Someone had been in the house. Someone was still in the house. The evidence wasn't visual or audible. It was deeper than that. A disturbance in the very fabric of the space, like ripples in water after a stone has sunk to the bottom. The bedroom at the end of the hall was last. I saved it deliberately, though I couldn't say why. When I finally pushed open the door, it swung inward with a soft creak that seemed to go on forever. The room beyond was dim, curtains drawn, but I could see enough. Empty bed, undisturbed furniture, nothing out of place. But the air in there was different, thicker. It moved differently when I breathed, like it had more substance than air should have. I stepped inside, just barely across the threshold, and immediately wanted to leave. The feeling was overwhelming, a physical revulsion that started in my stomach and spread outward like poison. I backed out quickly, pulling the door closed behind me. That's when I should have locked it. The thought was clear and urgent in my mind, but I didn't act on it. Some part of me, some deeper instinct, warned against making any sound that might draw attention to my presence. But before the search, before the certainty that someone was in the house, there was the arrival. I had driven for hours to get here, though the distance wasn't that great. Something kept making me pull over, park on the shoulder, sit with the engine running while I stared at nothing. The radio played static between stations, and I left it that way, finding comfort in the white noise that filled the car like auditory cotton. The house came into view gradually as I rounded the final curve. It sat back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown trees that hadn't been trimmed in years. The windows were dark, as I expected, but something about their darkness felt deliberate rather than simply unoccupied, like closed eyes pretending to sleep. I parked in the driveway and sat for several minutes before getting out. The key was heavy in my pocket, heavier than any key should be. When I finally retrieved it, the metal was warm against my palm despite the cool air. I squeezed it tight, feeling its edges press into my skin, using the small pain as an anchor to the present moment. The front door opened easily, too easily. I had expected resistance, the stiffness of disuse, but it swung inward at the slightest touch as if it had been waiting for me. The air that rushed out carried scents I couldn't identify. Not decay exactly, not mustiness, but something organic and patient, like the smell of soil just before it rains. I stepped inside and immediately felt the wrongness settle around me like a coat made of spider webs. Every surface looked normal, every object in its expected place, but the arrangement felt staged somehow, too perfect, too deliberately undisturbed. The silence was profound, not just the absence of sound, but something more active than that. A silence that pressed against my eardrums, that made me hyper-aware of my own heartbeat and breathing. I closed the door behind me, and the click of the latch seemed to echo through the entire house, bouncing off walls and returning changed, distorted. But I had come here for a reason, though that reason was becoming hazier the longer I stood in the entryway. Something about settling affairs, about taking care of business that had been left undone. The details slipped away when I tried to focus on them, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Before the drive, before the decision to come here, there was the phone call. I had been in my apartment, ordinary life proceeding in its ordinary way, when the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the quiet of the evening, and I almost didn't answer. Something about the timing felt wrong, too late for casual conversation, too early for emergency. The voice on the other end was familiar but distant, like hearing someone speak from the bottom of a well. They told me about the house, about things that needed attention, about responsibilities that couldn't be ignored any longer. The words washed over me without quite penetrating, but underneath the literal meaning was something else, something urgent and compelling that bypassed my conscious mind entirely. I found myself agreeing before I fully understood what I was agreeing to. Yes, I would go. Yes, I would take care of it. Yes, I understood what needed to be done, but even as I spoke the words, I wasn't sure they were true. Understanding felt just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that wouldn't quite form. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment and felt something shift inside me. Not a decision exactly, but a recognition, as if a path that had always been there had suddenly become visible, inevitable. I would go to the house. I would go tonight. The preparation was minimal. I gathered a few things, though I couldn't say what they were or why I chose them. My hands moved with their own intelligence, selecting items that felt necessary, though I couldn't articulate their purpose. The car keys were the last thing, and when I picked them up, they seemed to pulse with warmth like a living thing. But before the call, there had been the dreams. They started weeks earlier, maybe months. Time had become unreliable, events blurring together like watercolors in rain. At first, they were just fragments, a room I didn't recognize, a door that wouldn't open, shadows that moved independently of their sources. The dreams came every night, building on each other, adding details like layers of paint on canvas. The room became clearer, more defined. I could see the texture of the wallpaper, count the boards in the floor, trace the pattern of cracks in the ceiling. It was a real place. I became certain of this, though I couldn't say how I knew. In the dreams, I was always waiting, sitting in a chair in the center of the room, hands on my knees, watching shadows that seemed to watch me back. The waiting had a quality of finality to it, like the last breath before diving underwater. I knew, in the dream logic way of knowing, that something was coming. something I had summoned without meaning to, something I had invited without understanding the invitation. The dreams became more vivid, more detailed, until they felt more real than waking life. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth, with the phantom weight of that room's air in my lungs. My apartment began to feel insubstantial by comparison, like a stage set that might blow away in a strong wind. I started avoiding sleep, but that only made it worse. The dreams leaked into my waking hours, overlaying themselves on reality like double-exposed photographs. I would see the room's walls superimposed on my apartment walls, would feel the wooden floor beneath my feet even while standing on carpet. But the dreams themselves had started with something smaller, something I had almost forgotten until now, as I sit here in this chair, feeling the presence behind me grow stronger. It was just a photograph. I found it in a box of things that had been left to me, items I had inherited without wanting or understanding. Old papers, documents, the detritus of a life I had never been part of. The photograph was at the bottom, beneath layers of yellowed letters and faded receipts. The image was unremarkable at first glance, a room empty except for a single chair positioned in the center. The quality was poor, the lighting dim, but something about it held my attention. I studied it for a long time, tracing the details with my eyes, memorizing the pattern of shadows on the walls. It was just a room, just an empty room with a chair, but looking at it filled me with a sensation I couldn't name, something between recognition and dread, as if I was looking at a place I had been before or a place I was meant to be. I put the photograph aside, tried to forget about it, but it called to me. I found myself returning to it again and again, studying it like a map to somewhere I needed to go. The chair in the center drew my attention most of all. It looked comfortable, inviting, positioned perfectly to face whatever might emerge from the shadows. That night I dreamed of the room for the first time, and every night after the dreams grew stronger, more insistent, until they became more real than reality itself. Now, as I sit in this chair, in this room that matches the photograph exactly, I understand that it was never really a photograph at all. It was a destination, a coordinate in space and time that I was always meant to reach. The rustling behind me grows louder, and I feel a presence settling into the space, filling it like water filling a vessel. I don't turn around, I don't need to see what's there. I invited it after all, though I never understood I was extending an invitation. The bulb above me flickers again, and in that brief interruption of light, I see my reflection in the window one last time. But now I'm not alone in the reflection. There's something behind me, something that has been waiting in this room long before I arrived, something that needed me to complete the picture. I close my eyes and let the darkness take its final shape around me, understanding at last that some destinations can only be reached by moving backward, that some truths can only be seen in reverse, and that some invitations, once extended, can never be withdrawn. The photograph was never the beginning. It was just the moment I finally noticed what had always been waiting for me, patient and persistent in the shadows of my own reflection. Story 10. My steps felt short, as though the ground leaned away with each footfall, a rhythm broken by unseen hands. The curtains wavered, trapped in an airless dance even though the window was sealed against the outside. Somewhere near the counter a fork lay parallel to its twin, but I recalled setting it alone. The reflection in the glass offered a ripple not of movement but of time misplaced. I breathed in, expecting stillness, yet the clock nudged forward faster than my heart. Hours stumbled between seconds, and I knew today the sun rose twice. It started with the first dream, though I wouldn't call it that then. just a peculiar sleep, the kind where you drift but never quite sink. I found myself standing in a room that felt like my bedroom but stretched wider, the walls breathing with a gentle expansion I could sense rather than see. Everything was familiar yet slightly wrong, like viewing a photograph through water. Above me, an oval light pulsed with the rhythm of slow breathing, not harsh, not bright, just present. A soft luminescence that seemed to come from within itself, casting no shadows on the floor below. I remember thinking it was beautiful in that detached way you observe things in dreams, where wonder exists without question. The sound came next, a constant hum, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. It wrapped around my thoughts, not unpleasant, almost comforting in its consistency. I felt drowsy within the dream itself, which struck me as odd even then. How do you fall asleep when you're already sleeping? When I woke, the morning felt ordinary. Coffee tasted like coffee, the shower ran warm, and I dismissed the whole experience as stress from work. We all have strange dreams sometimes. The mind processes the day in mysterious ways, sorting memories and fears into strange narratives that dissolve with daylight. But the dream returned. The second time I lingered longer in that expanded room. The oval light still pulsed above me, but now I noticed it wasn't quite stationary. It drifted slightly, following a pattern I couldn't predict but somehow expected. The humming grew more complex, layering frequencies until it almost resembled a voice speaking in a language I didn't recognize but felt I should understand. I tried to move toward the light, but my body responded slowly, as if I were underwater. Each step took tremendous effort, and the floor seemed to stretch beneath me, keeping the ceiling always at the same impossible distance. The sensation wasn't frightening, just profoundly strange, like being gently held in place by invisible hands. A metallic quality crept into the humming, words forming at the edges of comprehension. I strained to listen, but the harder I focused, the more the sound slipped away, leaving only that persistent, modulated frequency. The air itself felt different here, charged with something I couldn't name. A sharp scent filled my nostrils, like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. When I woke from this second dream, something had changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift that made me pause as I brushed my teeth. The bathroom mirror reflected my face as always, but for just a moment I could have sworn the light above it pulsed once, very gently. I blinked, and it was steady again. At breakfast, I noticed the fork beside my plate, just one fork as it should be, but the memory of seeing two forks, parallel and identical, felt more real than the single utensil before me. I touched it, solid and cold, and tried to shake off the lingering unease. The dreams were getting to me, clearly. I made a mental note to cut back on caffeine before bed. But traces began appearing in my waking world, small details that felt pulled from sleep and deposited in daylight. A scent of artificial ozone when I opened the refrigerator. A brief electrical interference on my radio that sounded almost like modulated humming. Nothing dramatic, nothing I couldn't explain away as coincidence or imagination. The third dream arrived with startling vividness. The room expanded even further, walls dissolving into a soft, infinite space lit only by that persistent oval glow. The light had grown larger, or perhaps I had grown smaller beneath it. The pulsing matched my heartbeat now, or maybe my heart had synchronized to its rhythm. The metallic voice became clearer, though the words remained just beyond understanding. I felt as though someone was trying to tell me something important, something I needed to remember but couldn't quite grasp. The frustration built slowly, a gentle pressure behind my eyes that made me want to reach up toward the light. And then I did reach up, My arm lifted without my conscious decision, fingers stretching toward that pulsing oval. I felt as if I were being lifted, though no part of my body moved. A sensation of gentle ascension, of being drawn upward by something benevolent and patient. The voice grew clearer, almost familiar now, like hearing someone speak in another room through thin walls. I strained to understand, to remember what I was supposed to remember, but the words slipped through my mind like water through cupped hands. Time moved strangely in this dream. Minutes felt like hours, yet the entire experience seemed to last only seconds. I existed in a state of peaceful suspension, neither fully asleep nor awake, held in a space between spaces where the rules of ordinary consciousness didn't apply. Waking from this third dream took effort, like swimming up from great depths. My bedroom felt too small, too solid, too real after the infinite softness of that other place. I lay still for several minutes, trying to hold on to the fading details, but they dissolved like mist in sunlight. That morning I found a small mark on my arm. Just above the wrist, a tiny red dot that looked almost like a pinprick. I couldn't remember injuring myself, couldn't think of anything that might have caused it. The mark didn't hurt, didn't itch, just existed where it hadn't been before. I stared at it while drinking my coffee, turning my arm in the morning light. Such a small thing, barely noticeable, but it felt significant in a way I couldn't articulate, like finding a ticket stub in your pocket for a movie you don't remember attending. The dreams began to bleed into my waking life more frequently after that. I would hear the humming during quiet moments, a soft modulation at the edge of hearing that made me turn my head toward empty rooms. The oval light appeared in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight, pulsing gently against windows and mirrors. I started losing track of time in small ways, sitting down to read and discovering hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Starting to cook dinner and finding myself standing in the kitchen with no memory of the intervening moments, the stove still cold, ingredients untouched. Sleep became a fluid boundary rather than a clear transition. I would close my eyes in bed and open them in that expanded room, the familiar strange space that felt more like home with each visit. The light welcomed me back, pulsing in recognition, and the metallic voice resumed its patient attempts at communication. The voice was definitely familiar now, not someone I could place, but someone I should know, like hearing your own voice played back after years of forgetting what you sounded like. The words formed shapes in my mind, almost making sense, almost breaking through the barrier between understanding and confusion. During these visits, I began to notice details I'd missed before. The surface beneath my feet wasn't quite floor, wasn't quite ground, but something that yielded slightly with each step while remaining perfectly solid. The walls, when I could see them, curved in impossible ways, creating a space that was simultaneously vast and intimate. Most importantly, I wasn't alone there. I couldn't see anyone else, couldn't hear footsteps or breathing, but the presence was unmistakable. Someone watching, waiting, trying to help me remember something crucial. The sensation wasn't threatening, just persistent, like having a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to form. The waking world began to feel increasingly unreal by comparison. Colors seemed washed out, sounds muffled, interactions with other people distant and dreamlike. I moved through my daily routine like an actor following a script, performing familiar actions while my real attention remained focused elsewhere. Electronic devices started malfunctioning around me, not dramatically, just small glitches that created brief moments of interference. My phone would emit soft static that almost sounded like that modulated humming. The television would flicker occasionally, the screen pulsing with a rhythm that matched the oval light from my dreams. I began to suspect these weren't dreams at all. The realization crept up slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape you hadn't noticed in darkness. The consistency of the experiences, the physical traces appearing in my waking life, the growing sense that I was remembering rather than imagining. Something had happened to me, something real and significant that my conscious mind couldn't quite access. The metallic voice became clearer with each visit to that expanded space. I started to understand fragments, single words that carried weight and meaning even when I couldn't grasp their context. Return, remember, ready. Each word felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. I stopped calling them dreams. They were visits, appointments, sessions of some kind where someone was trying to help me recall what I'd forgotten. The gentle nature of these experiences suggested patience, understanding, perhaps even affection from whoever was guiding me through this process of remembering. The boundary between sleeping and waking dissolved entirely. I would find myself in that infinite, softly lit space at random moments, regardless of whether I'd been asleep or awake. The transition became seamless, natural, like stepping from one room into another. My physical body began to feel less substantial during these episodes, not painful or frightening, just lighter, more malleable. I could sense myself being gently examined, cared for, prepared for something I couldn't yet understand. The presence that watched over me radiated patience and kindness, never pushing, always waiting for me to remember at my own pace. The oval light had become a constant companion, visible now even in my ordinary waking life. It pulsed gently above me wherever I went, a faithful beacon that only I could see. Other people walked beneath it without noticing, continued their conversations while it cast its soft glow over everything. I realized I was no longer afraid of forgetting these experiences. Instead, I was afraid of what would happen when I finally remembered everything clearly. The knowledge waited just beyond my reach, vast and transformative, ready to reshape everything I thought I understood about my life. The voice spoke my name during the most recent visit, though I can't write that name here because it wasn't the name I'd always known. It was older, truer, a designation that belonged to who I really was beneath the layers of ordinary identity. Hearing it felt like coming home after a long journey I'd forgotten taking. Ready, the voice said again, and this time I understood that it wasn't a question. It was an observation, a gentle acknowledgement that the process was nearly complete. Soon I would remember everything. Soon the dreams and waking life would merge into a single, coherent experience. I found myself standing in my kitchen again, but the familiar space felt different now. The walls breathed with that gentle expansion I'd grown to love, and the oval light pulsed steadily above the counter. The sharp scent of artificial ozone filled the air, clean and electric and welcoming. 2 forks lay parallel beside my plate, exactly as I remembered from that first morning when I'd thought I was going crazy. But now I understood they'd always been there, waiting for me to see them clearly. Everything had always been there, patient and constant, while I slowly remembered how to perceive what was real. The humming filled the air around me, no longer confined to dreams or quiet moments. It wrapped around my thoughts like a familiar embrace, and I finally understood every word the metallic voice had been trying to tell me. The message was simple, profound, and completely logical now that I could hear it clearly. I was ready to go home. The kitchen dissolved into that infinite, softly lit space I'd visited so many times before, but this time I wasn't asleep. This time my eyes were wide open as the oval light descended toward me, pulsing with gentle welcome, and I reached up to meet it with perfect understanding of what came next. The last thing I noticed was the two forks on my kitchen counter, solid and real and waiting for someone else to find them and wonder why they were there, parallel and identical in a kitchen where only one person lived. Or had lived. The light embraced me, and I remembered everything.